I would like to first of all welcome everyone to the second open lecture of the Jakobsleiter series in 2021. We have had an open lecture last week. We will have another one next week with Professor Jakobsleiter. Today I will be hosting Professor Nádasdy from Eötvös Loránd University, a noted poet, linguist, translator, and the polyhistor, I would claim to say, or dare to say. He might challenge me on that later. The structure of the lecture will be as follows. First, in the next 5 minutes, I will just explain the whole setting of this open lecture series. Then we will have a short view on the structure of this present lecture today. And then I will start with a 30 to 35 minute sort of discussion with Professor Nádasdy, when we are going to cover topics of his career and, more importantly, topics of scholarly interest, which will be followed by a longer, say 50-55 minutes period of questions from the audience. So I would like to ask everyone to note their questions, to take notes during the first part of the lecture, and be prepared to come in the second part and bring on their own questions. The point being that we discuss as many topics as is needed, and the whole structure, as I sort of promised to explain, is that there is a peer-reviewed journal called Jakobsleiter, which we started this year, and this peer-reviewed journal aims at enabling high school students to engage with scholarly topics and paradigms, and to engage with scholarly discussions on a variety of topics. This year's theme is maps and models, and we would like to sort of initiate a thinking process by hosting this lecture series with a sequence of noted scholars. And we will today discuss a couple of topics which goes into this direction. So if we have, and I think I can see a couple of high school students among the audience. If we have high school students among the audience, I would like to specifically encourage you to dare to speak up in the second part of this lecture and bring your own questions to the table. This is a chance to talk to some of the most noted scholars of Hungary. Today, as I said, this honor goes to Professor Nádasdy. So with this, I would like to sort of introduce my discussion partner. Professor Nádasdy, who is a professor of Eötvös Loránd University, is a linguist, a philologist, a translator, and a poet. As not only a distinguished scholar himself, but a teacher of many generations of students of English language, as well as linguistics, as far as I know, although I have never had the honor of attending one of his lectures when I was a university student myself. And this is, as I said, the second iteration of our open lecture series. As for myself, my name is Andor Kenenegi. I will be hosting this open lecture, and I am in charge of the Jakobsleiter online journal. With this, I would like to start the conversation, and my first question is sort of an introduction on how I got introduced to you, Professor. I think I was probably 14 or 15 when I came across a short book entitled Három percesek a nyelvről, which, as far as I understood at that point, was an introduction into a variety of grammatic questions and discussions about the Hungarian language. And although I do not dare to claim that I understood even half of what I read, it was definitely the first step in my journey toward getting interested in languages, piquing my interest in issues of philology. And what I would like to ask you as a starting point is if you had any similar experiences in your career, any starting point when you have been exposed to something which launched you on this journey of scholarship.
Yes, thank you very much. And hello, everybody. And I'm pleased to be here with you and the audience. Yes, I had Latin at school because my English was quite good, and my German was also good because my mother was Austrian, and so we were half a German-speaking family. So I went to Latin, and in the Latin book there was a long chapter at the end in small print, which described the relationship of Latin to Russian, which came as a surprise to me, but it was very systematically described. Today, I know that this is trivial. They are both Indo-European languages and very similar indeed. Not the vocabulary so much, but the grammar. It is very, very similar. You have masculine, feminine, neuter. You have things like the nominative and the accusative of every noun in the neuter is always the same. Neuters end in a in the plural in both Latin and Russian, and so on and so forth. And I read this with genuine interest, because we have had Russian. Of course, I knew a little bit of Russian, just as much as one had to in those times. And this became a serious interest. At the same time, I knew Italian quite well, because my parents were musicians and they both spoke Italian. And so during the Latin class, I often began to think about how the Latin words differed from the Italian words, how you could derive Italian. So, for example, the word for mountain is mons in Latin and monte in Italian, but where does the T come from, I asked myself. But then if you take the accusative, it's montem in Latin, and the ablative is monte, and there you go. And so I discovered after a while that for some strange reason, the Italian doesn't inherit the nominative, but it inherits the accusative, or as I then thought, the ablative of the nouns. But then later I learned seriously that it's really the accusative which is inherited. Anyway, I was surrounded by languages which I partly knew and which I partly didn't know. And there were books or materials which opened my eyes to this whole world. Oh, plus, in the second year of my grammar school, a new Russian teacher came to teach us, who was a woman of Greek origin. She was Greek. And she didn't know Hungarian at all, but she was a native speaker of Russian because she grew up in Russia. And as far as I can remember, she had no idea of teaching, especially not teaching Russian as a foreign language. Maybe she was a teacher of Russian herself, but only to children whose mother tongue was Russian. That's a different job. And so she had absolutely no idea why we made mistakes and how she should have explained things to us and why we knew so little, of course, by the time she thought we would know much more. She struggled, but her accent was just beautiful. I had never heard authentic, beautiful Russian speech. And so I was sitting there, bored to death, mind you, by her stupid teaching, excuse me, but at the same time interested in the way she spoke. And I started taking notes about devoicing of certain consonants in certain positions, and palatalizations, and hard and soft, and all that, and the schwas, and so on. That by that time, I was in my second or third year in the grammar school, and yes, it was quite interesting. I drew up a model of how her speech could be generated. I didn't know the word then, but I do now. I did, if you like, a very simple generating machine on paper, which would map out the way her speech could be derived from the spelt form of the Russian word. So that there was a word for milk in Russian, moloko is the spelling. But the way she said it was moloko. And she had three different pronunciations for the O, the O, and the O. And then I started sort of looking for other examples. I think I even trapped her asking some stupid question so that she would pronounce a particular word that I was after. I know that this is called elicitation. You know, I used her as a native informant, and I would elicit things. She was a bit surprised why I would suddenly come up with milk in the middle of a class, which was about, I don't know, the Second World War or something. But anyway, yes, I did serious work.
All right. So it seems to me that what was of peculiar importance to you was this exposure to foreign languages, and I think this begs the next question that I would pose in this regard. To me, it seems historically somewhat surprising that you took up English at that point, and if you could elucidate on why you chose that language at such a young age.
Well, English is like any other language. What's the matter with English? I mean, why should you ask this?
There is no matter with English. It's just in my historical understanding, at that time there would have been German, which would be also fitting in your family environment, as far as I understand. You already spoke German. You could have taken up French. You could have taken up Russian, as you later did. But in my understanding, you already spoke English by that time, right? So you started rather young.
Yes. That was for romantic interest, because English was a language that nobody spoke in my environment, and it was somehow sort of challenging, so that, yes, I mean, because we were three brothers, we all had to have French because we were a middle-class family. And so everybody knew French better than I. I was the youngest of the brothers. And well, of course, German everybody knew, and Italian also. My parents knew Italian because they were musicians. And so that wasn't challenging. I didn't want to take up German. German sounded like home, like my grandparents. There was something embarrassing about German. The children would laugh at me because they heard I was talking German to my grandfather. We had a dog, for example, and we would walk the dog together, and then sometimes the children in the street would see me and start shouting in German, "Wo ist der Hund?" They would shout, "Where is the dog?" Because they knew that much, everybody knew that much German in those times. And I sort of wanted to get away from it. So I practically, how should I say, I concealed my knowledge of German for a long time because it didn't work. And yes, English. And so as a young boy, I started taking English classes, and that was somehow exciting, and nobody in the family spoke English. Actually, the people would ask me, like you did now, people would ask me, why are you studying English? Today, this question would not be sort of justified anymore. It sounded like, you found somebody who is studying Lithuanian, and you would ask, why are you studying Lithuanian? Do you have anybody there, or are you planning to visit Lithuania, or why? Well, that's exactly what people ask. And I just shrugged and I said, well, it's interesting. And then suddenly, when I was about 15, the pop music explosion came from England. And suddenly it all made sense, and I could understand what the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were singing about. And okay, not a whiter shade of pale, that still I don't understand, but I was reassured to find that the text does not make sense, really. Yes, they skip the light fandango as the miller told his tale, and so on. Okay.
All right, so the way you present it now, it seems like it's sort of arbitrary that you ended up becoming a noted scholar of English philology. But yet there was a point of decision, right? You decided when you got to the age of going to university that you would embark on English literature and Italian.
Yes.
So
yes.
What was the reasoning then?
Italian I knew well because I often went to Italy, and one needed a second subject, so I added Italian because why not? English was my real interest, if you like. because I always wanted to be a linguist. I was always more interested in the formal side than in the cultural or literary side. It is interesting, of course, that after so many years, I ended up as translating works of literature in English, plays by Bernard Shaw and Shakespeare, and Dante's Divine Comedy in Italian. But both of these branches of my activities are about texts pretty old by current standards. Even Bernard Shaw is more than 100 years old, or 100 years old now. And so my training as a linguist comes in very handy in treating these texts. Anyway, yes, English, and I taught English as a foreign language with great energy and élan, and I liked it and wrote various textbooks or took part in projects, writing textbooks and so on.
Many of those who go to study languages at university have a very clear plan of becoming teachers later on, or some sort of financial consideration behind knowing a foreign language, which would give them a good career prospect. And as far as I know, you also started right after university, started to teach at a high school. But then later on, you decided, or it turned out so that you ended up being an academic. And my question is, if there was a specific point that you can sort of clearly state where you decided to become a scholar and to stay in this university career pathway.
There was a conference at Ph when I was a young grammar school teacher, and it was about English and Hungarian, the two languages contrasted, the two grammars put side by side. And I remember I gave a paper, put hard work into it, which came from my teaching experience about relative pronouns. What and which and that and zero, you know, the book I'm reading, the book which I'm reading, but never the book what I'm reading, which is a typical Hungarian mistake, but why is it a Hungarian mistake, and so on. And that was well received. That I got a surprising amount of discussion there, and people, adults, people much older than myself, already in the business, came up to me and said how interesting it was, and so on. And that is probably where an older colleague from Eötvös Loránd University, Mrs. Stefanides, who used to be my teacher earlier and who knew that I existed, she must have realized then that this young man has an interest for the formal side of language, for analysis and so on. And then a year or two later, somebody went abroad or fell ill, or I don't remember, or maybe became pregnant, and so a substitute had to be found. And so they contacted me if I wanted to do that, and I did, yes. And so I continued then with this line of research.
And did you have a mentor figure as a young scholar? Did you have someone that was... You go on, sorry.
Not enough, I have to tell you, not enough. Both of the departments where I got my instruction, that is to say the English department and the Italian department, were very much literature oriented. There was very good teaching methodology and coaching and mentoring. I used that, but that wasn't linguistics. Okay, the teachers who taught linguistics were decent and they knew their job, and their English was excellent, which at that time was a big thing. Not everybody's English was very good, and it wasn't even a requirement that you should speak the target language so well. It was a bit like in the classics department, you know, where it would have been ridiculous to require that you should speak Latin or classical Greek fluently. Why? I mean, it would have been a stunt, really. So anyway, back to linguistics. No, there was as much as there was a man called Professor Hutterer, and Hutterer was a professor of Germanic. That is to say, the prehistory of English and German and Gothic and Dutch and Scandinavian and so on. And he gave lectures on that subject, which first, I have to tell you, was a bit strange to me. But then I connected it to this Latin Russian thing, and it fell into place. And it was Hutterer who then later also included Yiddish into his realm, which is a variety of German, linguistically speaking. Culturally, it's very different, being spoken by Jews in Eastern Europe and elsewhere in the world. But linguistically, it's an interesting dialect or variety of German, as you can say. And Hutterer included this into his curriculum, and that's how I got acquainted with this language. And anyway, but by the time I finished my studies, I suddenly realized that I really needed a master, and that was Zsigmond Pelegdi, the professor of general linguistics and of Iranian studies. Iranian basically meaning Persian, okay. And I went up to him and I said, Professor, I would like to study with you. And he became a bit embarrassed and said, well, what can I do for you? And so in the end, it turned out that the best idea would be if I took up the course in Iranian. And so I studied with him for 4 or 5 years, and that's really where I became a linguist, because I could go with him into his workshop, so to speak. Okay, Iranian was a small branch. There were few students. You could always talk to teachers and professors and so on. And that's really where I took my training.
At the beginning of this conversation, I sort of dared to claim that I consider you a polyhister, and I think. Sorry, go on.
I don't know anything about chemistry or physics or. Come on, I mean.
Well, probably, but I think you just proved my point beautifully by just listing the incredible range of languages with which you are familiar, the incredible range of cultural environments in which you feel comfortable. And what I would like to ask about this specifically, with regards, perhaps in a more general way, with regards to scholarship, is, do you think it is an advantage to be well-versed in different sciences, or do you sometimes feel, or do you have any experience that would indicate that this sort of fragmentization actually decreases from one's capability of engaging with his or her subject matter?
This is a valid question. I can't shrug it off. It also depends on, how should I say, it depends on your digestive system. You know, some people prefer to eat the same kind of food all the time. Others need a bit of sweet, a bit of sour, and so on. I feel better if I do various things, but you may be right. That doesn't take you very far into one particular depth. Don't forget that I may be a professor and you may describe me as a polyhister, which is an exaggeration, but I haven't become a member of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, which otherwise would have been a nice sort of goal or end or objective of a career like mine. And some of my colleagues have, and deservedly so, and I haven't, because I switch from one thing to the other. I don't specialize enough. Maybe I'm not patient enough. Maybe, yes, maybe I get impatient after a while. I don't know. So I wouldn't recommend. But then on the other hand, if somebody is like me, then maybe it's not good to be chained to your bench and drudge away with things that don't interest you enough. Sorry about that. Yes.
Absolutely. I mean, I fully agree with you. I am personally, I'm also interested in multiple things, and I could never be chained down. But perhaps moving on towards an even more general way, into more scholarly questions now. Just as an ending point, I would like to ask what you would say is the good as a marker of a good scholar. So how would you describe, if you had to describe a good scholar in one sentence, what defines a good scholar?
You are using the word scholar and not scientist. Does that mean that you are talking about somebody in the humanities?
Not necessarily, but I wanted to make this distinction, yes.
Because I know less about how to become a good chemist or physicist or mathematician or geologist or whatever. In the humanities, I think that in order to be a good scholar, you do need a large amount of lexical information. It is important. It is important to know, if you're a historian, for example, I think to be a good historian, you have to know a huge amount of data by heart. And if I ask you, when did Charlemagne die, then you have to be able to know that. Was it 812?
I think it was 814.
There you go. You see, yeah. Okay. The same in languages. Okay, you can analyze, of course, one language and you can go to very good data, but it's always very good if you know that in Hindi you have a similar phenomenon, and in Arabic this is pronounced blah blah and whatever. That is to say, a huge amount of data, and data are beautiful, data are exciting. And in scholarship, you always, I mean, in the humanities, you always have a bigger need for or literature for that matter. And you have to read a lot of books in order to become a literary scholar, in order to analyze one book or one writer properly. In the humanities, it's also important to know what earlier generations said about the same thing. Whereas this is not the case in physics or chemistry or astronomy and so on. It is probably interesting, but it's a different subject. In other words, in a science faculty, you always have a subsidiary subject called history of. Okay, so I suppose in the physics course, you have a subject, a minor subsidiary subject called history of physics. But this would be ridiculous in the humanities courses to have a subsidiary subject, history of whatever, because that's really the thing itself. So I say, go into the humanities if you like data. If you're like a gardener who looks around and knows the names of many trees and so on, even if you then sit down in front of your microscope and look at a cell where it doesn't matter any longer whether it is wheat or rye, because you're not, after all, such superficial phenomena like being wheat or rye, but what you want is the living cell.
With this, I would like to move on to one of the core topics for today, namely the English language. And I would like to start with a seemingly very stupid, or perhaps actually very stupid question. Do you think that English language, learning English, is more difficult than learning other languages?
No, no. Difficult is not a word which linguistics uses at all. We don't use this word. It would be like saying in biology, you know, do you think to be a snake is more difficult than to be a lizard? Well, I don't know. We don't do that. I mean, the snakes don't say this and the lizards don't say it either. Children, how should I say, acquiring their mother tongue show no difference. Okay, all languages are acquired by native speaker children at the same rate, with differences, of course, but they don't depend on the language, they depend on the person. For a Chinese, for example, Hungarian or Czech or Italian are equally difficult. The vocabulary exotic, okay? Now, for a Hungarian, Italian might be easier because you have words like teatro, the theater, problema, the problem, and bellissimo, very beautiful, and so on. But if you're Chinese, then teatro, bellissimo don't help you at all. In other words, in lay parlance, easy and difficult often means when you compare two languages, how close is the vocabulary, how close is the grammar? Well, of course, then it matters a lot, but that's for adults, or anyway, for mature speakers who already have a mother tongue. Yes, and in that case, I don't know if English is easier for Hungarians than German. I don't know. We never had such experiences with colleagues in the German department, and students taking their final exam were not better in English or in German or the other way around. No.
The reason I brought this up, admittedly in a very provocative manner, is that the opposite is something that I often hear when I talk to students who claim that, oh yeah, English is an easy language to acquire. It didn't take me much time, and now I'm turning toward more difficult ones. And so what I'm wondering perhaps is, why is this perception around, especially nowadays, that English is something easier to acquire? And does it say anything about the nature of the English language that we, for example, here speak? And this is, I would say, markedly different from the nature of the English language that two inhabitants of London would use in a conversation similar to ours.
This is really a question about social psychology, not about linguistics, okay? It's also the way these languages are taught. English has little morphology. You know what morphology is? That is to say, the various endings that the words can take on. And people often think that the less morphology there is, the easier the language will be. Now, that's not true. And English is actually very tricky because it has little morphology. But the syntax, of course, is much more difficult. You may not even realize that you're making mistakes, whereas with the morphology, the mistakes become very obvious. Okay, say you're learning Hungarian, whether it is bon or ben, whether it is knock or tól, whether it is olvasott or olvastam, various endings, you can spot the mistakes there. I have to tell you that I have friends who are of foreign background, say English or German, and who have learned Hungarian quite well. This is no problem for them. They never mistake bon and ben and olvasott and olvastam and so on. What they do have mistakes in, and where Hungarian is killingly difficult, is the verbal prefixes. Elolvastam, olvastam. A friend wrote to me the other day in Hungarian, most of you speak Hungarian, you will understand. Nagyon tetszett nekem ez a vers, úgyhogy fordítottam. You can't say that. You have to say lefordítottam. And can you see, otherwise everything is perfect in his sentence. The endings are okay, the word order is okay, the verbal prefix is in English, for instance, you have the tenses, which are very, very difficult, much more difficult than in German or French. The difference between I read the book and I have read the book is something that you will go on having problems with till the end of your life. I have to start, I know English very well, I taught all my life, I'm a professor, and I have to hesitate sometimes. Is this I read the book or I have read the book? I never hesitate in German about this, or Italian or French. Another thing in English, just little things like you can say in English, I am certain that he will come. You can also say, I am sure that he will come. The meaning is the same. You can say, it is certain that he will come. But you can't say, it is sure that he will come. Why not? Well, because sure belongs to that category of words which you can't put into the syntactic position. Okay? English doesn't have a morphology, or very little of it, but it has syntactic rules, and it has the syntactic rules are just as subtle as those of Hungarian. You can say, he told me to go home, but you can't say, he suggested me to go home. Okay, now those people, Andor, who tell you that English is easy, I'm afraid they are not aware of these things. And they innocently and happily rush in where angels fear to tread. Okay, and of course they are understood, but then, sorry, being understood is not what we are talking about. Okay, being understood is easy in all languages.
I think that beautifully brings me to my next question, which is again going to be a very provocative one. I have been following quite arduously your public intellectual career and your discussions with fellow linguists and scholars of other fields about the nature of language and the nature of grammar. And my understanding, but correct me if I'm mistaken, is that you argue heavily against the notion of correct and incorrect language. As a linguist, and yet just now you have been using terms such as error, mistake, rules, laws of language. So I'm curious, how could you harmonize these two positions?
It's not me who says this. I mean, any language, any linguistics textbook will tell you this, from Vancouver to Vladivostok. This is linguistics, okay? What the layman thinks about correctness is property or elegant language use, but that is always when you have a choice. In English, for example, you can choose between I don't know anything or I don't know nothing. Okay, some people use this, some people use the other. That's all the linguist can say. The fact that these groups of people both hate each other and consider that they do the wrong thing, and that one group says that the others are uneducated bumpkins, and the other says that they're all snobs, and you know, I mean, this is very, very interesting, but that's sociology. That's very similar to whether you have a garden or you don't, what kind of dog you keep, and other things. Clothing and so on. Do you understand what I mean? That's not, the linguist has nothing to say about that. These are, how should I say, this is etiquette. As such, it is very important, but it has no linguistic background. The linguist can't decide, because there are languages which have I don't know nothing, like Hungarian, nem tudok semmit. Okay, this is called negative concord. Hungarian has it. There are languages which are like English. I don't know anything, or I know nothing. Anyway, German is like this. Ich weiß nicht. Okay, well, that's interesting. But, you know, some animals have legs, others don't. That's all we can say. When we use correct, that means would a native speaker say this? I don't know, nothing is correct, of course, in that variety of English. Okay, that's all. If somebody said, I don't nothing know, haha, that's incorrect. That's incorrect because that sounds like a Dutch sailor trying to speak substandard English. Okay, that's a different thing. Yeah.
This brings me, and this is probably going to be my last question, and then I would turn to the audience and ask them to bring their questions on. But this just one more thing that bothers me here, namely that you have been giving just as this last point, you have been bringing an example of languages influencing each other. And we can see that in many languages. You have been talking about this at the very beginning of this conversation, how Latin and Italian are obviously related, how French and Italian, and so on and so forth. Often languages of different linguistic families influence each other. And my question is, with a very, very shady understanding of the history of English, as little as I know, is that it has a huge Latin, it has some Greek, and it has a huge French element in it, and some Anglo-Saxon element in it. So how long can we call English English if it is heavily influenced by other languages? How long can we call French French if it is heavily influenced by German? And the list should go on and on.
This partly depends on what the speakers themselves call it. Okay, so yeah, if they call it English, well, let them have it. What really matters to us is the machinery. How can I say? Imagine like a train, a freight train made up of lorry cars, and you can change the cargo that is carried by the train, but the wheels and the cars and the mechanism is the same. Now, English is obviously a Germanic language because the article is the and not le or la as in French. The adjective is before the noun white dog and not after it, chien blanc as in French. You never say, look, there's a dog white running in the street. That's Germanic to say white dog, okay? You just said a sentence, that's interesting. You said, how long can we call English English? All these words are Anglo-Saxon. How long can we call English English? If it is, and now comes the first French word, influenced. Okay, and then back by another language. Now that's, again, interestingly, a foreign word. English has very, very many loan words in its vocabulary, but the grammar is hardly influenced at all. A few influences may be detected, like the of genitive, so that we say the roof of the house today rather than the house's roof. That may be a French influence. Okay, le toit de la maison. But otherwise, very, very little. For example, you have in French a kind of past tense with have, okay? J'ai chanté. And word by word, this translates as I have sung, but that's not what it is, because it is I sang, actually, j'ai chanté. So even if on the surface it seems to be similar, you have to be careful. No. So we say that it is the structure which matters and not the vocabulary. And this is called the structural principle. And it is more important for us linguists. Culturally speaking, the vocabulary can be very interesting. Take Hungarian again, which structurally is obviously one of the Uralic languages, or Finno-Ugric. Well, it's a branch of Uralic. Whereas the vocabulary, very, very large amount of the vocabulary is borrowed from Old Turkish, from Slav, from German, from Latin, from Italian, from English, you name it. Okay, but the structure is Uralic.
Thank you. At this point, I would like to invite members of the audience to unmute themselves and ask their questions so that we can turn this into a discussion of multiple parties and not just two. Don't feel timid. This is precisely the venue and the time to ask your questions, and I'm sure that there are multiple questions out there. So please, yeah.
So my question to Professor Nádasdy would be about translation. You said at the beginning of the conversation that that was one of the branches that stemmed from you being a linguist. And my question would be why you particularly chose those texts to translate and not others?
Let me answer this way. Why I do older stuff is because I'm not afraid of older stuff, because of my studies of linguistics, including historical linguistics, makes it a bit more accessible for me. Also, it means that I'm less at home with contemporary stuff. I wouldn't try to translate a contemporary play because I'm not so much at home in it. That's not my field, as it were. Now, say, take the Shakespeare plays or the Bernard Shaw plays or the Oscar Wilde. Which play I did depended on the commission. It depended on the theatre. It is always the theatres that wanted it. But they know that I can be charged with doing old stuff, and that I would do it. And I'm not afraid of the footnotes in the critical editions. I'm not afraid of the small print. You remember my Russian Latin textbook, which had small print in it. That's why, really. Also because I speak German well, and I always use German translations to check on my Hungarian translations to see what the German colleague did, how they translate. Thank you.
Thank you.
Feel free to unmute yourselves. I'm sure there are questions.
Yeah. May I just pop in to say that I'm from that generation when we had to study German. So I remember that when I was a small child, I started with German, and later on at the university, I got English. And we met there with Ádám at that time. And when I would like to add to it the question of difficulty, how difficult the language is, and comparing German and English, I had an old teacher when I was a kid, and he gave me a very good explanation for that. What was the difference between German and English? And he compared it to a forest. And he said, when you start studying German, you walk into a very deep forest. It's dark and frightening, and you get slowly out of the forest, and then it gets lighter, and you're smiling, you find the sunshine, and it's easier. Now, it's just the opposite with English. You get into an easy walk into a very nice little forest, and as you get deeper into it, it gets darker and darker, and darker, and you feel you will never get out of it. And I found it a very good explanation to the difference between the two.
Yes, thank you very much. You're right, because you don't realize at the beginning how much problems we will have between I work and I'm working, and I have worked and I have been working, and so on and so forth. You're right. Or even with things like in Amsterdam, I overheard a conversation from another table where an Italian tourist was talking to a Dutch guy, and the Dutch guy said to him, wanted to make conversation. They were probably waiting for someone and they were just making small talk. And the Dutch guy said, well, what brings you to Amsterdam? And the Italian said, well, my camera. Because he misunderstood the sentence, of course, in the sense that what is it that you bring with yourself to Amsterdam? In other words, what do you bring to Amsterdam? And he spoke English, you know, otherwise they made conversation, but he totally misunderstood the sentence, what brings you to Amsterdam? And he was a bit surprised, what a stupid question. And so he had his camera with him and said, well, my camera. Maybe he was a photographer or something. And then I said to myself, there you go. This is exactly what you said, the forest becoming darker and darker without the poor Italian guy realizing where he is. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And of course, I must add to it that at that time I didn't understand, because I was starting with German. So I thought, okay, I can speak German, and I found that perhaps English might be more difficult, but I didn't find that after all. But they coexisted, the two languages coexisted in my mind, which made it difficult. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. I would like to connect to the question Andor was asking about what makes a good scholar. Now, at Milestone, we obviously work with secondary school students, and we work hard on their orientation to ensure that they find something that they feel passionate about, and you know that's going to help them become successful and happy people in their lives. And oversimplifying it maybe a little bit, but the main avenues one can take after graduating from university is academia, public sector, private sector, like I say, with some oversimplification. And some of us obviously stay in academia, and I think I know a lot of people, including myself, who leave academia and then kind of from time to time sort of regret that or just feel that longing, you know, towards academia. So I was just wondering, what would you say may help students, or what is it in themselves that they should look for to know that academia is the field that they should, you know, that they should stay in?
I suppose a certain childish abandonment to a problem where you know they don't notice that they put on different socks in the morning because they're still thinking about the problem. That is certainly true, that there's a certain amount of loneliness also in academia, which doesn't fit everybody. You know, some people like to be in a group, in a team, in a classroom, surrounded by 20 children or students, or in an office, that kind of thing. But the academic thing is basically a lonely one, especially in the humanities. Yeah, for mathematics even, I suppose there's not much to do teamwork there. So whether they can, you know, sort of daydream for a while about a problem, I think that is important or interesting. I know some people who earn They're living as in the public sector or in the private sector, but at the same time, they write articles and go to conferences on one particular thing that they can manage, or people who teach in schools. I don't know about the sciences. I'm sure that they exist there as well, but in history or in literature, I know that some school teachers also have a hand in academic life. But it's basically, I think, to ask yourself whether you can spend a morning or a night alone thinking about something. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm happy to sort of push on the conversation with a question from my side, just to perhaps introduce a couple of other directions here. Dalma asked you about translations, and one thing that I'm always interested when it comes to translations, and you have yourself translated from multiple languages in a variety of genres. One thing that is always a question for me, and I would like to hear your view on that, is when one translates from a language to another, even if it is, even if you consider only the translation of a sentence in a speech, one has to consider different factors: style, vocabulary, grammar, syntax, and so on and so forth. So when you are working on a translation, do you see a clear priority of these factors in the original that you have to reproduce in a certain sequence in the translated version?
That's hard to tell. It's a bit like cooking. You know, you open the lid, you smell, and you say a bit of pepper, and put the lid back again. Don't forget, I do literary translation, not technical translation. That's a different thing. It has to be A, and B has to be B. But I do, especially for the stage, where in a matter of seconds, the same effect has to be achieved, funny or tragic. But the most important thing is faithfulness. You have to write the same as in the original. Of course you can't, but now then you begin to say, all right, you can only deviate as much as absolutely necessary. Okay, how necessary is absolutely necessary is the next problem, and that's when the cooking metaphor comes in. Okay, only put in as much pepper as necessary. That's all I can say. But yes, the basic idea is to write the same, and I often find in other people's translations elements where I say, hey, why did you write something different from what is in the original? Why did you write Thursday if the original has Wednesday? Well, not at this level, of course, but very often you will find differences that to me are unexplainable and unpardonable, in other words. Okay, so every deviation has to be explained in some way. Thank you.
I see many of some of the students of Maestron here. I would very much encourage you to speak up and bring your questions. I'm sure you have some. While you're gathering your thoughts, perhaps some other members of the audience have questions. Please come forward.
So I have a question. This time it's related to the journal that we will be launching, and sort of in the description to the students or to the audience of the journal in the call for papers, we talk about that moment when the right idea just clicks into place and suddenly it all makes sense. I was just wondering whether in your translation, in your work in translation or in your linguistics work or whatever, Do you remember any such moments when, you know, it was just something that you had been working on and suddenly this light just came on? Or are there any moments that you can remember that were like that?
Yes, of course. In linguistic analysis, it's hard to recall the moment, of course, and often it comes from discussion with other colleagues. It's what we call in Hungarian, when you have two words meeting and you have three consonants clashing together, one from one word and two from the other, or the other way around, they behave differently. This is what we call the partitkar problem. Okay, this word means party secretary, it's a compound. And partitkar is normally pronounced with one T, even though they come with two T's, okay? But if the first word has the consonant and the second, and if the third consonant is in the first word, then you can drop it, but not the mirror image. So you have hot droger, for example. Can you see that's the mirror image? And you can't say hot droger. And I definitely remember we were sitting in a train going to Szeged for a conference with linguist colleagues, and well, someone came up with this problem. Did we ever notice, and so on? And we found out that this is really a rule in Hungarian pronunciation, which nobody had thought of previously.
Thank you.
Yes.
Perhaps something that also relates to the grander image here, or the grander image here. The theme of this year's Jakobsleiter is maps and models. And what I keep wondering about throughout our whole conversation is that the world is full of patterns. And often the task of the scholar or of the simple human being who thinks is to describe, not to describe, but to recognize, and perhaps it is the job of the scholar to describe these patterns. And I'm wondering how specifically your fields, your interest in linguistics, your interest in language history can help you describing the patterns in the world, whether they are of a linguistic nature or something else.
Very often we draw flowcharts to map the way languages have changed. And it is important, for instance, to realize, well, that's not my discovery, but one from the middle of the 20th century, that if you have a language change in which two sounds merge into one, they will continue as one in the future. And if they split into two, I will explain everything. If they split into two, the split will never mirror the original merger. And this is called the Markov process. It comes from mathematics or logic. That's all I know about this, or it's a, let me give you an example. I take the English words meet, M-E-E-T, and meet, equally pronounced M-E-A-T. These used to be different in the Middle Ages. The poet Geoffrey Chaucer obviously pronounced them differently because he never rhymes such words with each other. Now, around Shakespeare's life or a bit later, these two sounds, so one would, in Chaucer's life, the meaning to encounter would have been pronounced mate, and the other, the flesh, would have been pronounced mat. Mate and mat, okay, two different sounds. By Shakespeare's time, to encounter would have become meet, and the other would have become mate. That's how the Irish still pronounce it. Okay, that's classical Irish English. A cup of tea, they would say. Okay, for British English, a cup of tea. Okay. And then comes what is called the meat-meat merger. That is to say, these two, which have been traveling the same, suddenly become one, and they go on with meat-meat. And now it's just a matter of spelling, that they are spelled in a different way. Okay, like Hungarian, you know, hoyo and foyo, they have the same y in the middle, but one is spelled with a J, the other is spelled with ly, because a long time ago they used to be pronounced. Good. Now, however, you have the same type of word in, let's take beer, the drink, and clear, meaning light, okay, or washed. These also were the same in Chaucer's time, okay, clear and clair, bear and bear, whatever. Today, they are pronounced differently if there's a r after them, so that I have meat, but beer. Can you hear the difference? And my pronunciation is old-fashioned, I'm old. But if I was young, I would pronounce meat and beer for the drink, okay, pint of beer. And the other one would be exactly the same. That is to say, the split today depends on what comes after them, whether there's a r or not, but it equally affects words with a double E and an EA in them. Okay, so once they merged meat, now they can split, but the split will depend on the following sound and never on the original pair. That is to say, it's not retrievable. Language change has no memory. That's a very important thing to notice. Okay, that's what is called, okay, a finite state stochastic model or a Markov chain or whatever. This is something where you can actually map on paper what is happening, and we do. We have to draw lines and show how it works. Thank you.
Thank you. And so just to follow up on this, what are the limitations of trying to model things? Because I would imagine that they are sometimes misleading.
You have, yeah, your models are normally bidimensional, okay, whereas language change may be tridimensional, and that's sometimes not easy to illustrate, that you have three factors working at the same time. Yes, sometimes we use, do you remember when I went to school, the kids in the other class, they had geometry, and we didn't because we had Latin, and they had geometry, and they had a book in which there were very complicated diagrams printed in colors, green and red, and they had glasses, spectacles made of paper, and one eye was green and the other eye was red, and they would squint with one eye, and then they would see one half of the diagram, and then they would squint with the other eye and see the other half of the diagram. Can you follow what I mean? And we would envy them, of course, because this book was so beautiful and we didn't have it. And so in the intervals, we would ask them to allow us to wear the glasses, and we would squint one and the other eye. But of course, we didn't understand what it was about. But anyway, and they then told us that this is multi-dimensional diagram. Yeah.
Thank you. We have time for a couple of more questions, so I would like to encourage the audience to grab this opportunity, this unique opportunity of being able to talking to Professor Nádasdy.
Related to this last topic of models and their limitations, one thing I have a very vivid memory of when I was in my first couple of years at university at Dante, incidentally, and I was doing my introduction to linguistics and then syntax and all of these subjects. So I remember having these conversations with friends from a very different field, mathematics and IT and whatever, and my going on to them about how great it is that in linguistic analysis, essentially, and again, this is oversimplifying once again, but what you are trying to do is to sort of come up with a system that in the descriptive rather than a prescriptive way sort of explains or produces models that explain why a given form is acceptable by native speakers or non-native speakers. That's a whole different matter, which is one that we would mark with a question mark because some speakers would say okay, some people not, and which one would be marked with an asterisk, and how you can sort of develop models to explain what's okay and what's not okay. So to include all the good options or acceptable options and exclude at the same time acceptable options. And there are numerous challenges to this, like you said about the dimensions, that language changes over time and all of that. And as I was talking about these challenges, I got the question like, so why bother? Like, we use language anyway. We acquire it, I don't need to sort of go into linguistic analysis to speak my language or indeed to learn another one. And it seems like a mission impossible anyway, because of these things that you have described. What would your response be to such a, and I'm playing devil's advocate here, obviously, but what would be your response to such a notion?
It's not easy really to give a good answer. Maybe I would just say it is the gift of God that we have intelligence, and it is in a way his imperative that we should try to find out the secrets of his creation. Do you like this answer? I think that's a good answer, and it's valid as well. And so once he created us to be thinking animals, then it's our duty to go after his secrets. It's very poetic, if you like, very traditional, but it's true. I mean, we have to describe it because it's there. Mm-hmm. I go to the Galapagos Islands and describe those animals there. Well, because they're there, and because God created them, and so we have to describe them.
Well, this is pretty much a good response to all scientific analysis, really,
yes.
Isn't it?
Indeed, yes. Of course, you might say there's a number of applications, and of course, like foreign language teaching, like artificial intelligence, like machine translation, curing aphasia, when somebody has brain damage and they lose part of their speech. Or if you can't cure it, you can help to diagnose what happens, because often the doctor doesn't realize clearly because the machines, the CT and the MRI don't show anything, and it is the linguist which will tell the doctor what the matter is, because we know how language loss works. Understanding old manuscripts, forgotten languages, providing an orthography to people who speak a language without having a literacy behind it, and so on. Okay, that's all very nice. It's a bit like observing the human body. your friends might have said, well, why analyze my system? I'm healthy, I work anyway, so why do you have to go into all that? There, of course, it is much obvious what the applications are. But don't forget that often early doctors did not so much do it in order to cure people, yes, but also out of curiosity. You know, how does it work? What happens? Thank you.
In terms of the practical applications, you said what I came back with at the time was exactly the sort of the medical area of it and foreign language teaching, because I ended up on an applied linguistics sort of pathway. But what you said about artificial intelligence, I think, you know, I kind of wish I had that in my pocket sort of 20 years ago, 15 years ago, because I think there will be a tremendous, you know, scope for linguistic analysis in that field. I mean, even if we just look at how in language testing even, you know, they are now thinking, Cambridge Assessment, for example, is saying that we are not far, like pretty much 3-4 years from now, that not only will samples of one's language use in the format of a language exam will be analyzed by, you know, by AI, but even the questions will be produced and the text to be used for it will be produced, you know, using AI and all the data from linguistic analysis. So yeah, thank you very much again.
The translations provided by a simple desktop machine like mine are frighteningly good and becoming better and better. And sometimes I sometimes think there's a little man sitting there and giving me the answer, but obviously it's the machine.
So do you think it can happen that at one point, because of AI being so great at linguistic and looking at data and obviously having the capacity to analyze past language data as well, way beyond the capacity of any certain human individual or group of researchers or whatever, do you think there may be a point in the future where AI makes us redundant in this field?
No, but I don't know. Yes. I don't know. It's nice to be talking and writing and so on. So I don't know. It's a bit like it's nice to be walking. Obviously, maybe 100 years ago, people thought that everything will be so electric and machine-wise that we will never take steps anywhere, and we will always be sort of driving along like sick old people do today, you know, sitting in their electric chairs. But you don't find this. People find it quite normal to walk around. So maybe that will happen with language as well. I don't know. Thank you.
I see that there's a question in the audience. Feel free to speak up, Balint.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I do not want to diverge too much, but I must note this, that as far as I know, every experiment with doing translation by rules failed miserably. So I want to say that AI do not speak any language. AI do only statistics. It takes text from this language and that language and compares them. So I think that at this moment we don't have to fear about AI outsmarting us, because it's not smart. It's just very, very fast in quotes reading text. So if we want to feed it with rules, it never works. It cannot understand rules in the sense we human linguists can understand rules. It just does very simple, I must say, simple statistical comparisons of sentences and such things.
Thank you very much. Indeed, this is what I understand also, that yes, the machine is very, very diligent and very fast and has access to a large number of data and database. And this is not what the linguist is interested in, basically. But the problem is, of course, trickier than that, because we thought in the 1970s and 60s that the human brain was generating sentences online on a rule-based matter, that you had the input and then you did drr, 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 and then out came the output. And now the AI also makes us think that there's at least partly a lot of the human brain is like that, that we just remember a tremendous amount of things, that we have a tremendous amount of things ready-made rather than generated online. Though it is still true that if you input nonsense into the native speaker, they will still come up with rule-based behavior. And I don't know, maybe, well, of course, maybe AI does. I don't know. So you have, nobody had difficulty in Hungarian, for example, when President Obama was president and his name was pronounced the Hungarian way, Obama. Very interesting why, actually, and why not Obama, but he was pronounced Obama. We all agreed that this was the educated Hungarian pronunciation, Obama. And that the accusative or the suffix form would be Obamat. That is to say that the final R would change to A, which has absolutely nothing to do with the English language or his original name or anything. It's a rule in Hungarian. But you might say, of course, that AI would also then very quickly look at 25 million Hungarian nouns which end in the letter A and notice how they behave, and would then produce his name accordingly. So it's difficulty. The most interesting still is the young child who makes mistakes and says things that he shouldn't, you know, which, you know, like in English, a young child would say, I goed to see my grandmother, rather than I went to see my grandmother. That is to say, over-regularization. And that obviously proves that he's working online and producing rule-based sentences. Thank you. Yes, you're right.
I think we have time for one more question. So this is the moment for those who have kept silent to raise their head, raise their hands, raise their heads, and raise their voices.
So artificial intelligence is not intelligence at all, really, in the sense that we would mean. Okay, it's artificial language production, artificial combination, and so.
Anyone? This is really the last chance to do so. I would really want to encourage our younger audiences, members of the audience who are younger, to speak up at this point. If not, as I'm gathering here, then I would like to thank you everyone for attending today's second open lecture. So the second open lecture that was taking place today. We will have one more open lecture next week on a Wednesday, the same time, 5 o'clock. It will also be taking place online. Then the guest will be Csaba Plé, a noted psychologist, linguist himself, cognitive scientist. We will cover a similar array of a variety of topics. And as today, the audience will have the chance to interact with Professor Plé next week. So as for today, I would just like to thank you once again for everyone to attend this open lecture and for the interesting questions. And I would like to specifically thank Professor Nádasdy for being available for today and for the very interesting presentation and all the interesting things that he said. Thank you.
The pleasure was mine.